So why is constructor injection the preferred method of dependency injection over its alternative, which is field injection, at pretty much any circumstance when it comes to Android development? The answer to that question has to do with testing. When you're writing tests, you're writing instrumentation tests, you're writing unit tests, whatever the type of test, it's always better to know what dependencies you need for any given object when you're writing the test for that object. So like if you're testing a repository, it's much easier to know that the repository requires, 4 objects as opposed to having to open up the repository and see that, oh, I have to make sure that this object is ready. I have to make sure that this object is ready. If they're required for the construction of the object, or in other words, when they're required in the constructor, then you already know what it needs, and it's much more convenient to build the test for it. So much like all of the other classes that you are probably familiar with building tests for, like repositories, view models, any kind of random data sources, any random classes, really, it doesn't matter. There's also Android-specific classes that are also nice to do constructor injection with. And the one that I'm going to talk about in this video is fragments. So most of you probably think that it's not even possible to do constructor injection with fragments, but it actually is. There was an update, I'm not sure when, it was maybe... I'm gonna throw out a number here because I don't know the exact number. It was maybe 6 months ago. The Android team added this new class, this new FragmentFactory class that basically enabled us to do constructor injection with fragments. So in this video, what I'm going to be doing is using that new FragmentFactory class to do constructor injection to a fragment, and we're going to see how this is all handled with Hilt. So I'm going to use the new dependency injection framework built on top of Dagger, which is Hilt, and I'm going to be showing you how to not only just do it with the plain old, begin fragment transaction, support fragment manager, fragment transaction way, but we're also going to be doing it with navigation components because it's a little more tricky, but I think you'll find it's still pretty straightforward by the end of this video. Okay, so the code that I'm starting out with here is from a video that I just did yesterday. I'll put a link up here to it. But if you want a link to the source code, it's going to be down in the description of the video, or you can go to my GitHub, go to Dagger Hilt Playground. It actually says Player Ground, but that was a typo. It should be Playground. Go to the repository and check it out. So you can just get the repository, check it out if you want. Or just make sure you click on the branch Fragment Constructor Injection. That's going to be the endpoint code for this video. If you want to look at the same code that I'm looking at right now at the start of the video, you want to check out the branch Basic MVI Repository Pattern. That's the code that I'm looking at right now. And by the end of the video, it's going to be Fragment Constructor Injection. So let's get started. So as you saw in the previous video, which is the one that I'm carrying on from, we have a single activity. I'll actually launch the app just so you can see. So the app launches, you see a progress bar, it pulls some network data, it caches that data, and then it displays that cached data in the UI. There's just a single activity and a single layout, which is activity main. So here's activity main, just a progress bar, a text view, nothing fancy. We got a bunch of packages here. Again, check out the previous video if you want to know where all this stuff is coming from. But the fragment constructor injection stuff really has nothing to do with anything else that we've done so far, so you could just follow along even if you didn't watch that previous video. So main activity, pretty straightforward, just getting the view model, getting some data from the view model, doing all the stuff. Pretty basic, again, watch the previous video. So now we are going to set up for this new fragment that we're going to create and do constructor injection on that fragment. So the first thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to build a new layout file. So I'm going to right click on layout, go to new layout resource, and call this fragment main and click OK. And sure, I can add that to Git, why not? And I'm just going to copy the previous layout from activity main because we're going to basically move everything that's in activity main into the new fragment, and then and then activity main will basically just be a container for the fragment. So there is our new layout, which is the progress bar and the text view, which is basically just what we had before, but it was in activity main. Now let's go to activity main and make the required changes. So I'm going to pretty much empty this out. So I'm going to delete the progress bar, delete the text view, delete these tools, and I'm going to change this constraint layout to a fragment container view. So for those of you who don't know, the fragment container view is a new view that was created. Again, I'm going to throw out a number here. I think it was about 6 months ago when they created the FragmentFactory, somewhere around there. I'm not exactly sure. And it was to replace the frame layout. So remember before we used to use a frame layout, and that was used for containers for fragments and a bunch of other things. It was a very robust layout. So the the fragment container view is the replacement for that, and it can handle everything. It can handle navigation components, just being a general container for fragments, basically everything the frame layout could and more. So I'm going to give this an ID of main fragment. I could call it main fragment or main fragment container, whatever you want. Now that we have the updates to activity main, we have our new fragment layout. Now let's build that new fragment class. So I'm going to right click on UI, go to new Kotlin file, and call this main fragment, and then just select class here. So of course this is going to be a fragment, so I'm going to extend the Android X fragment class, and I'm going to pass the layout up here. So r.layout.fragmentMain. And that should give me, there we go, got that in there. So again, for those of you who didn't know, you can now pass layouts to the class extension constructor when you're building fragments. That was another one of the things that was added about 6 months ago. I'm going to say, again, not 100% sure on the exact timeline there. That was when FragmentContainerView was added. You can pass the layout to the fragment constructor, the class extension, and also the FragmentFactory, which we're going to be looking at later. So all of this stuff was added around the same time period. Okay, so we are going to add a constructor to this fragment. So I'm going to add a constructor here, and I'm going to have a single dependency because I want to be able to inject something. It's nothing important. I just want to show you that something can be injected. So I'm just going to inject like a string, just like I'm going to call it some string and inject some string. So usually like you wouldn't be just injecting something random like this, but again, this is just an example. I just want to show you that something can be injected through the constructor. So I'm just going to inject a string just so you can see it. Now this fragment class is pretty much ready to go because we are passing the layout to the fragment up here. Before you used to have to insert on create view, and you would have to on create view, yeah, this one, and you need to pass the layout to the super and tell it what layout you're using. We don't need that anymore. Basically, it's all good with this layout passing through the constructor here. So I can delete all this stuff and our fragment is pretty much ready to go. Now, keep in mind, we are going to change some stuff in this fragment. It's not complete. Basically, by the end of the video, I'm going to move everything that's in main activity over to that fragment class. But for now, just leave it as is. And this is going to give us some warnings because we've changed the layout. But again, just ignore that. We're going to fix that stuff later. Now let's build the fragment factory so that we can pass dependencies through the constructor of this fragment. So I'm going to go into the UI package, create a new Kotlin file, and I'll just call this main fragment factory, and this is going to be a class. So add that to Git, doesn't really matter. This is going to extend the fragment factory class, and I want to initialize that. Now I am going to be providing this through Hilt, so I'm going to annotate the constructor with @inject and get that import there and tab this in just so it's kind of cleaned up. And through the constructor of the fragment factory, you need to pass all of the dependencies for any of the fragments that you have. So in our case, the only dependency that we have is some string. So we are going to need to pass that as a constructor argument to the main fragment factory. If we had more dependencies, like if there was, I don't know, private value some object, and this was like some other object, maybe we had private value, I don't know, just for example's sake, maybe we're passing like our main repository here. If all of these objects were being provided into our fragment class, we would also need to provide those to the factory because we're going to need them when we build the fragment, which you're going to see in just a second here. So just to make that really clear, and also if you had more fragments, like if you had main fragment, if you had like main fragment 2, main fragment 3, whatever your fragment name, whatever dependencies that those fragments required, you would need to pass them to the constructor of the factory that's building them. So just to make sure that that is really clear. So there's the dependency, the only one that we need because all we are passing is this one single string. Now I'm going to insert a function, so Control O, and get the instantiate function. And this function will be responsible for building whatever fragments this factory is responsible for. So I'm going to write return when the class name, and open this up and just do main fragment, and then do class.java, .name. And there's a couple ways you could do this, but this is just the way that I generally do it. If you have a different way, that's fine too. So now I want to instantiate main fragment and then just pass some string. And as a last case, we want to be able to return the super. So just do else and then do super instantiate class loader class name. So that's it. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward, nothing too exciting here. The only thing to keep in mind is if you had more fragments in your project, so if this one only has one fragment, which is main fragment, but if you had more fragments, you would have more cases inside of the when statement. You would have, however many cases you needed to instantiate all of the fragments that factory is responsible for. Okay, so we have the factory, we have our main fragment. Next, let's build the module that will provide this string, because we do need to provide this because it's being injected through the constructor here. So let's go into the DI package. I'm going to create a new module because I don't want to use any of the old classes. Like I said, I want you to be able to watch this video and not have to have watched the video before. So I'm going to keep everything separate and just create a brand new module. So I'll call this app module. This is, again, a Dagger Hilt thing. If you're not familiar with that, I have a Dagger Hilt playlist, also my website. If you want to watch all of the videos that have to do with Dagger Hilt, the new dependency injection framework, you can just go to codingwithmitch.com, go to courses up here, and here it is, the Hilt dependency injection course. It's completely free. It keeps track of your progress. You can see a little progress bar over here. You can just click on this and go through the videos, and you'll see it'll keep track of your progress. So we want to install this in the application component. Again, if you don't know anything about Hilt, I encourage you to go watch the course and it'll teach you about everything that I'm about to do here. This will be a singleton. I'm going to annotate it with app provides and just do provide some string, because that's all I'm doing. I'm just returning some random string. I'll just say it's some string exclamation mark. So there's our string dependency. I've installed it into the component. Now the fragment factory will have access to that through its constructor. And also our main fragment will also have access to it because it's being passed to the constructor right here. So we could test this by maybe inserting on view created, and I'll insert log t here. So this is a template. You probably won't have this in your Android Studio. This is a template that I built. Just write private value tag string app debug or whatever string you want. And then I'm going to print that string to the log. So I can say, I guess here is some string, and then just print that and say some string. So now if this fragment comes into view, we can at least look in the log and see if our dependency is being provided like it should be. So to test this, I can go to main activity and I will comment out a bunch of this stuff. I guess I'll just comment out all of this because we're going to move this into main fragment later anyway. So I'm just going to comment all of that stuff out. And now to do the fragment transaction, so to actually bring this fragment into view, what I can do is I can set the factory and then do the fragment transaction. So I will inject the factory up at the top of main activity here. So I'll do add inject late init variable, fragment factory, so main fragment factory. I guess I don't need to annotate this with an entry point. That's fine. So just inserting the fragment factory, and now I can do support fragment manager dot fragment factory and set that equal to that fragment factory. Then I need to do the transaction. So support fragment manager begin transaction dot replace. I want to reference the container. So r.id dot main fragment container. Then the fragment class that I'm going to be bringing into view. So I'll say main fragment class.java, and then null for, I believe those are arguments being passed, and then .commit. So that's going to do the fragment transaction. That should bring main fragment into view, and then we can see if that dependency is being provided through the factory. So let's run that. I'll open the log and we will take a look. So I'm filtering the log on here so I can see here is some string, and there it is. Here is some string. It's some string. So we know that therefore the dependency is being provided through the constructor and it is available inside of the fragment. So that's great. Now let's do this with navigation components and kind of move everything into the other fragment, into the fragment class. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this view model and move it into the fragment. So if I'm moving the view model into here, I also need to annotate this with Android entry point. So Android entry point, because this view model is being injected using Hilt. So I need to make sure I add that annotation. Now let's move everything else into here. So I'll uncomment this up here, grab these two, cut that, go to main fragment, paste those down below, and I want to give myself some more room here, so give myself some new returns. Go back to main activity. I'm going to uncomment all of this stuff. So that's uncommented. That looks good. Now I'm going to cut it. I'm going to delete all of these unnecessary imports up here because these are no longer needed inside of main activity. Go back to main fragment and paste all of this stuff in and get the imports. There's a couple more imports that it looks like it needs to get. Make sure to get the Android X lifecycle observer for that import. text, that's all good. And then change this to get view lifecycle owner for the observer. The last thing here is this is giving me a warning saying I'm using some experimental features. So I'm just pressing Alt Enter and then getting that annotation. You don't need to add that. It just kind of gets rid of that warning saying, yes, I know that I am using an experimental feature here. This I can get rid of off of the view model. All right, so now everything should function exactly as it did, at the end of the previous video, the difference being that we have a fragment. So now main activity is pretty much empty. All it is essentially a vessel for hosting the fragment, and then the fragment has all of the content. So let's run this, and after we run this and see that it's working, then we're going to convert this to use navigation components. So there's the app launching, there's the progress bar, and then there's the data getting pulled from the network, cached into the database, and then displayed in the UI. And if I open up the logcat down here, we see that, hey, there's our string still working correctly. So everything's working correctly, everything's working exactly as it was before. The difference being that now we have a fragment, we're doing constructor injection with the fragment, and we are printing out that dependency just to make sure that we actually do see it, we do have it. All right, so now let's set this up with navigation components. So I'm gonna close all of this stuff and stop the app. And I'm going to create a new navigation graph. So right clicking on res. Oh, by the way, if you don't know how to use navigation components, I should say I have a free video on YouTube. So if you go to youtube.com/coding with Mitch, I have a free video. It's quite long. It's like 45 minutes to an hour, but it shows you everything you need to know to get started with navigation components. So I think it's called navigation components in one video. So I'm just searching navigation component, and there it is right there, Jetpack navigation component in one video. So that shows you everything you need to know to get started with this. It's basically the new way to navigate Android apps using fragments, this new kind of navigation graph system, which is way better than the old way in my opinion. So I encourage you to check that video out. Also, my courses, pretty much all the new ones use navigation components. So clean architecture, all the UI testing ones, model view intent, powerful Android apps, all of these use navigation components. So if you were curious, go and check out those courses and see a more practical, realistic example of how to use navigation components. Some of them are paid, some of them are free. You'll have to go to the website and check those out. So I'm right clicking on res here, going to new Android resource file. Make sure to change this to navigation and call this nav main. That should be, yeah, that's what I forgot to do. So we're going to add a single fragment. So pressing the plus button up here, adding main fragment. Now we have main fragment added to our graph. Now I'm going to go over to the XML tab here. And it actually looks like this is all fine. So we have our start destination. That's what I was looking for. We have an ID, so nav main. So everything should be good here. Now this is going to be the kind of the trickiest part of this whole video, I would say, coming up next. So previously, when using navigation components, if you were injecting a FragmentFactory, if you were just using regular Dagger, what you could do is you could take the FragmentFactory, and before onCreate, you would do your inject with Dagger, and then you could set the FragmentFactory right here before onCreate was called. But with Hilt, you can't do this. So if you take a look at the Hilt documentation, which I'll pull up right here, you can see that Hilt will do the injection right here before onCreate, and we can't get access to whatever we inject until after onCreate is called. So this causes a problem because if we inject our FragmentFactory and we don't set it until after onCreate, this will cause the app to crash if there is a rotation because the fragment gets recreated and it won't be able to find that constructor before onCreate is called. So it has an issue. So this is kind of one downfall, I guess, if you're using Hilt and you're going to use navigation components because it's going to be a little bit trickier. But I'm going to show you a workaround that it's actually pretty straightforward and you should have no problem with it. So I'm going to move this back. I'm going to delete this, get rid of all those lines, move this back. And we need to create a new class in the UI package. So I'm going to right click here, go to new Kotlin file, and I'm going to call this main nav host fragment. So if you're familiar with navigation components, you know that navigation components revolves around this kind of default nav host fragment thing. And I'm going to extend by that class. So nav host fragment. So what we're doing here is we're creating a custom nav host fragment that we're going to set in our layout. So normally what you would do is you would go to your fragment container view and you would do the name parameter. You would do Android X dot navigation or whatever the package is. And it would be like nav host. You would use the default nav host fragment. I don't know if this package is correct, but the point here I'm trying to illustrate is that you would use a nav host fragment here. Well, we can't use it because of the issue that I just pointed out. So we need to create a custom one, which is what I'm doing here. And what we're going to do to this custom one is we're going to mark this with Android entry point. So Android entry point, and then we can inject our fragment factory into here. So late init variable, fragment factory, main fragment factory. And then I'm going to insert the onAttach method, the onAttach function, onAttach, get the one that takes the context as input, this one right here. And then after onAttach is called, I want to set the fragment factory to the child fragment manager. So child fragment manager, fragment factory equals the fragment factory. Now let's get rid of this warning. So this is that experimental coroutines feature warning. Just pressing Alt Enter, getting that annotation, and then adding that up at the top here. So here is our custom nav host fragment that now knows how to use our custom factory. So now we can go into activity main, and instead of setting the name parameter to the kind of default nav host fragment that I just kind of showed you, we're going to use our main nav host fragment. So I need to copy the package structure. So come back to main nav host fragment, copy the package structure, type that in here, and then just do dot main nav host fragment. Now this knows how to use our custom nav host fragment and therefore our custom fragment factory. Now we need a couple other parameters here, and if you're familiar with navigation components, this is going to look very familiar to you. We need to set the default nav host and set that equal to true, and we need to set the nav graph. So we need to tell it where to find the navigation graph that we're going to be using. So at navigation and get main nav, which is what we just created. And that should be good. Let me just kind of go through this one more time, just make sure I didn't miss anything. Of course, we can get rid of this fragment factory now, get rid of this, get rid of all of this stuff. We don't need any of that. We do still need to have Android entry point here because any fragments that are kind of hosted from an activity must be hosted from an Android entry point activity. So we still need to have this. This is something that Hilt requires. If you have any fragments that you're injecting dependencies into, the activity that's hosting those fragments also must be an Android entry point. So that's why I'm going to leave that there. And we have our main nav host fragment, which is being set in activity main. We have our main fragment, which is getting our dependency. So now let's run this and we'll test it and make sure that everything is working. So here's the app launching. There you can see the progress bar showed. We get the data. Now here comes the part that is going to determine if this worked or not. We're going to do the rotation. Does it still work? Yes, everything works exactly as before. So if you would have not built this custom nav host fragment and you would have just, injected the factory and then set the support fragment manager, like did support fragment manager fragment factory and set it right here, it would have crashed on rotation. And that was because of the issue that I outlined before. The fragment factory needs to be set before onCreate, but because Hilt does the inject before onCreate, and it actually prevents you from using any of the injected dependencies until after onCreate, which causes that problem. So that's going to be it. Oh, actually, I guess one more thing we should check is make sure that we do get our string printing out. So I'll filter on app debug, and let me actually clear it and I'll rerun it just to make sure. So I cleared the log, I'm rerunning the app, there's the app launching, and there is our dependency printing out, again showing the rotation, and there's the dependency again, so everything is good. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. That is how you do constructor injection with fragments, both with the old way to navigate, so using the support fragment manager, and also how to use navigation components, which is like, quote unquote, the new way to navigate with fragments. And if you're interested in seeing, why constructor injection is advantageous for fragments, why it makes testing easier, I highly encourage you to go to codingwithmitch.com. I have many courses on testing from beginner level to quite advanced level. If I was to give you any recommendation, if you've never tested before, I would say start at the beginner level course, the Espresso beginner course, and then maybe jump into the clean architecture course, because it's not just about clean architecture. There's a lot about testing, because the main reason why clean architecture is so great is it makes testing easier. So probably over half that course is actually testing. So I highly encourage you to go and check that out. As always, do not forget to leave a like. YouTube does not recommend these videos unless you tell it that, yes, this video was good. Yes, this video helped me. So please, if this video helped you, if you've never seen fragment constructor injection before, if you didn't even know it existed, if you maybe thought about it but didn't know how to do it, this video helped you. So go and tell YouTube that this video helped you. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.